At 6:12 a.m. on Monday, the 22nd of May 1978, the lobby of a printing shop near Chicago's Loop smelled like paper dust and burnt coffee. Eddie, the front clerk, lifted the metal gate and stacked invoices on the counter. The vending vendor arrived like he always did. Gray shirt, key ring, a nod that didn't ask for talk. Eddie had minutes on paper, and a building address he couldn't explain. The vendor worked fast. Rows filled, door shut. Lock turned. Then, with no coin in his hand, he pulled the coin return lever once. He listened to the empty rattle and let it snap back. 3 Mondays later, at 6:12 a.m. again, he did the exact same thing. Eddie told himself it meant nothing. The building was quiet. The hour made people strange. He didn't confront the man. He just decided to write the time down. After the vendor left, the lobby went back to its usual noises, the air unit breathing, the street outside waking up, the copier in the back room clicking like an insect. Eddie kept the gate half up. He liked the feeling of being open, but not fully. The vendor's route was the kind of privilege nobody called privilege. He didn't need to check in at the desk. He didn't need a visitor badge. He carried his own authority in a gray shirt and a ring of keys that could open doors Eddie wasn't supposed to touch. Eddie watched him once, not the next time, then again. Each visit had the same small choreography. The dolly squeaked. The canvas bag thumped. The machine door opened wide enough to hide his hands. Coins clinked in the tray. The lock clicked twice. The lever pull was the only part that didn't belong. No customer did that after a restock. No vendor needed to. It was like a punctuation mark in the routine, placed where no one would read it. Eddie wrote 6:12 on the edge of an invoice, then folded the paper and tucked it under the register drawer. He hated the feeling of making a secret out of nothing. He hated it more when he remembered the sound. That dry, empty rattle, like a message that couldn't be left out loud. Later that morning, when a delivery guy came in with boxes of stationery, Eddie asked, casual, if the vending company had changed routes. The delivery guy shrugged. Those guys always show up before anyone's awake. That was the problem. The building was full of rules, and the vendor lived outside them. If Eddie asked the manager, he'd sound paranoid. If he said nothing, the lever pull would keep happening in the quiet where only Eddie could hear it. On the wall by the phone, the calendar page curled at the corner. Eddie took a pen and circled the next Monday. He didn't write a name. He didn't write a theory. He wrote one thing and underlined it twice. 6:12 a.m. On Monday, the 12th of June, 1978, Eddie looked up at the wall clock and felt the lobby go still a second early. 6:12 a.m. clicked into place. The minute hand didn't wobble. The fluorescent tubes didn't flicker. The building just held its breath the way it always did before the first real customers arrived. The vending vendor came in on the same gray shirt as before. Same key ring. Same polite nod that stayed on the surface. Eddie watched the hands, not the face. The dolly squeaked across the tile. The canvas bag bumped his leg when he turned. He restocked like a man inside a schedule, not a man making choices. Chips, candy, soda. One practiced sweep of the glass with his sleeve. Door shut. Lock turned. Then the vendor leaned in and pulled the coin return lever, even though he hadn't put a coin in. A dry rattle. A snap back. Nothing fell. Nothing needed to. Eddie's stomach didn't drop. It didn't jump either. It just tightened in a slow, quiet way, like he'd been bracing without knowing it. He waited until the vendor walked away, then glanced down at his counter. He still had the scrap of invoice edge he'd written on weeks earlier, folded and hidden under the register drawer like a bad habit. He unfolded it with the tip of one finger. 6:12 was there in his own handwriting, underlined twice. He didn't feel clever. He felt pinned. After the first time, it was easy to tell himself it was nothing. A nervous tick, a habit, a person doing a small thing because nobody was watching. But now it had happened again in the same minute window, like the building itself had been used as a clock. Eddie walked to the vending alcove and stood too close, pretending to straighten the little rack of brochures nobody read. The plastic around the coin return was smudged with fingerprints. There was a faint gray smear where someone's thumb always pressed. The vendor's keys jingled once, farther down the hall, not at the front door, at the inner door that led to the back corridor. That door was supposed to stay locked until management arrived. It had a small metal sign that said "Staff Only" in faded black letters. Eddie saw the vendor's shoulder angle toward it. He heard the clean click of a key finding a place that accepted it. The door opened. The vendor slipped through like he belonged there, and the door swung shut again without a slam. Eddie stood holding his brochures and stared at the seam in the frame where the latch sat. He wasn't supposed to think about how many people moved through the building on borrowed access. He was supposed to think about orders and paper and whether the front gate rolled smoothly. He went back behind the counter and took his lunch break early, not to eat, but to walk to the corner drugstore and buy a pocket notebook small enough to disappear in his palm. Back at the desk, he wrote, May 22, 6:12 a.m., June 12, 6:12 a.m. He didn't add theories. He didn't add names. He added a third line and left it blank. On the calendar by the phone, Eddie circled the next Monday and pressed the pen hard enough to tear the paper a little. He told himself he was doing this so he could stop thinking about it. But as the lobby warmed with morning noise, Eddie kept hearing that empty rattle, like a signal meant for someone who wasn't him. And the only thought that stayed steady was the time he planned to arrive next week. Monday, the 19th of June, 1978, before 6 a.m. On Monday, the 3rd of July, 1978, Eddie arrived at 5:55 a.m., early enough that the street outside still looked undecided. The lobby lights were on, but the building felt unclaimed, like it belonged to whoever showed up first, and acted like they had a reason. Eddie lifted the gate just enough to slip through, then pulled it down again until it hovered a few inches above the floor. Open, but not welcoming. He set his coffee on the counter and kept his pocket notebook under the invoice stack. The fluorescent hum had a way of making time feel louder. Every second landed. At 6:07, nothing. At 6:10, the elevator coughed somewhere above him. At 6:11, he heard footsteps, but not from the front door. They came from the side corridor, the route that led past a service entrance most customers never noticed. The sound was different there, closer to concrete, a narrower echo. Eddie didn't move. He just turned his eyes, like turning his head would count as an accusation. The vending vendor appeared from the service side with the same gray shirt and the same key ring, but now Eddie understood the shape of the trick. The man wasn't arriving. He was already inside. He gave Eddie the usual nod as if they'd both agreed this was the only doorway that mattered. The dolly rolled behind him. The canvas bag bumped his knee. No sign-in, no pause at the desk, no glance at the calendar or the posted rules that applied to everyone else. The machine opened. The restock happened. The door shut. The lock clicked twice. Then the vendor leaned in and pulled the coin return lever. A dry, empty rattle. The snapback sounded sharper today, like the lever wanted to be heard. Eddie felt the familiar tightening, but he kept his face neutral. He wanted to see what happened after the signal, not the signal itself. That was the difference between superstition and watching. The vendor stepped away from the machine, and for the first time, he didn't go straight to the back corridor. He stopped near the lobby wall where a bulletin board sagged under old notices. He pulled out a clipboard and ran a finger down a list. Eddie couldn't read the words, but he caught the geometry. Building codes, floor numbers, little blocks of time written like appointments, boxes with check marks, a route built like a timetable. The vendor's thumb covered the top line. The lower half was exposed for a second long enough for Eddie to see a partial heading with a company logo he didn't recognize. The paper looked too official for vending, too neat. The vendor sensed eyes and shifted his body, casually, not aggressive, just enough shoulder to hide the page. He tore off a small perforated strip like a receipt stub and slipped it into his shirt pocket without looking down. Then he walked toward the inner door again. Eddie listened for the key click. It came fast, clean, practiced. The door opened. The vendor went through. The door shut. Eddie stayed behind the counter, hands flat on the laminate, feeling like his own job had become a disguise. He pulled the notebook out and flipped to the first page, where he'd written, May 22, 6:12 a.m., June 12, 6:12 a.m. He added, July 3, 6:12 a.m. entered from service side. He paused, then wrote one more line beneath it, smaller, clipboard route sheet building codes, time blocks. He stared at the ink until it stopped looking like ink and started looking like a decision. If the vendor could appear from inside the building before anyone else arrived, then the uniform wasn't just a cover. It was a key to thresholds Eddie wasn't meant to notice, a way to be invisible while moving through locked spaces. Eddie slid the notebook back under the invoices and looked at the lobby phone like it might ring and tell him what to do. It didn't, so he chose the next smallest step, small enough to survive being wrong. He would find out who held the vending contract. Not the vendor's name, not a theory, just the name on the paperwork that made the gray shirt unquestioned. On Monday, the 10th of July, 1978, the call came at 9:20 a.m., when the lobby was no longer quiet enough to hide inside. The voice on the phone belonged to a woman from upstairs, irritated, clipped. Your machine ate my money. It's not giving change. We need somebody down here. Eddie wrote it down like it was any other complaint. Like it didn't matter that vending calls were the one thing that reliably summoned the gray shirt man. By 10, the alcove was a small crowd. A delivery guy waiting for the elevator, 2 office women with coffee cups and folded arms, a man in a tie tapping his watch like time was personal property. The lobby smelled like wet wool and toner. When the vendor came in, he didn't look surprised to be watched. Same gray shirt, same key ring, same nod, only now the nod was for the room, not for Eddie. He set his dolly down and opened the machine with his body turned sideways, shoulders shielding the lock from the people standing too close. It was a simple move. Professional, even. Like he'd learned long ago where eyes naturally went and how to make them go somewhere else. Eddie stood behind the counter with his hands on the laminate, feeling the heat of attention without anyone actually looking at him. The crowd wanted a fix. They didn't want a story. The vendor leaned in, hand disappearing behind the inner panel. Metal clicked. A soft scrape like something being slid, not lifted. He spoke once, not to Eddie, but to the air. These older units stick when it's humid. Chicago had been humid for weeks. It was an excuse everyone could accept. Eddie stepped out from behind the counter, keeping his voice ordinary. What company are you with again? I'm updating the building file. The vendor didn't pause long enough for the question to grow teeth. Same one as always, he said, and smiled like the matter was settled. Eddie tried again, lighter. Right. Just need the name for the contract. You will. The vendor's eyes flicked up for the first time, not hostile, just measuring. Talk to management, he said, and turned his shoulder more fully to the machine. That should have been the end of it. A normal deflection in a normal lobby, but management heard it anyway. Eddie's supervisor came out from the back office with a stack of invoices and a tired face. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't need to. The crowd gave him a stage. Eddie, he said, sharp enough to cut through the small talk. Stop bothering vendors. They're here to fix it. You want to scare off service? You pay for it. A few people laughed the polite laugh that says, not my problem. Someone muttered, yeah, let the guy do his job. Eddie felt his ears warm, not from embarrassment exactly, but from being reduced to a nuisance in front of strangers. He nodded once, like he'd been corrected fairly. The vendor kept working. He reached deeper into the machine, and Eddie watched the movement of his forearm. Small, efficient, practiced. When the vendor stepped back, Eddie saw it. The coin box seam, the edge of the lock housing. There were scratch marks there. Not random wear, not the soft, dull scuff of years. These were thin, repeated lines, clustered in one place, as if a tool had been introduced and withdrawn again and again carefully, not angrily. The vendor closed the panel, turned the key, and tapped the side of the machine once. A little performance beat for the audience. Try it now, he said. A woman dropped coins in. The machine clunked, delivered a candy bar, and the change returned with a bright, innocent jingle. The crowd dispersed as fast as it had formed, satisfied by motion and sound. Eddie waited until the elevator doors swallowed the last onlooker. He watched the vendor pick up his dolly and walk away without looking back. The supervisor returned to the back office, already forgetting he'd made Eddie smaller in public. Eddie stayed where he was and stared at the lock scratch marks until they burned into his memory. He didn't write them down yet. Not in front of anyone. Not while the lobby was awake. He understood something then, quiet and final. Faces could lie. Faces could change. Uniforms could be swapped. Hands were harder. From now on, he wouldn't try to catch a name. He would watch what the hands did where they disappeared, what they touched, what they protected, and he would keep his questions inside his pocket notebook, where nobody could laugh at them. Monday, the 31st of July, 1978. Eddie opened the gate at 6 a.m. and set his coffee where the ring stain already lived. The wall clock said 6:09. The lobby sounded normal. The air unit cycling, the soda machine humming, the distant thump of a freight elevator. At 6:11, nothing. At 6:12, still nothing. The absence hit harder than the lever pull ever had. The pattern had been the only solid thing in it. Eddie kept his face calm and his hands busy, straightening invoices that were already straight. He watched the glass doors for movement and tried not to look like he was waiting for someone in particular. At 6:18, a man stepped into the lobby and stopped near the payphone. Eddie hadn't seen him come through the front gate. He appeared the way the vendor did sometimes, already inside the building's skin. The man wore a dark overcoat despite the heat and held a folded newspaper like a prop. He didn't dial. He just stood close enough to the phone to claim it. Eyes down, posture still. The paper was folded to a narrow strip, and the fold looked practiced, repeated, like hands that did the same thing every day. Eddie looked at the clock again. 6:23. The man at the payphone shifted his weight once, as if listening for a footstep that wasn't there yet. At 6:30, 18 minutes late, the vending vendor came in from the service corridor. Same gray shirt, same keys, same nod that did not include the man by the phone. He went straight to the machine. No lingering, no glass wipe, no coin-counting show. The door opened and shut fast, hands disappearing behind the inner panel for only a beat, like he was checking that something was still in place. Then he pulled the coin return lever. Dry rattle. Snap back. He locked the door and walked away at once, keys already swinging, as if the restock had been an excuse he could not afford today. Eddie watched him pass the inner door, heard the click, and then the building swallowed him. The lobby held a short silence. Even the soda machine seemed to pause between breaths. The man at the payphone unfolded his newspaper 1 inch wider, then refolded it. He waited 5 seconds, maybe 6. Enough for the vendor to be gone, not enough to invite questions. Then he moved. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around. He walked to the vending alcove like a customer who knew what he wanted. He leaned in, not to buy anything, but to the coin return, and his fingers went into the cup for a moment. When he stepped back, Eddie saw something left behind. A small rectangle of paper, stiff, pale, like a receipt stub. It sat where loose change would sit, innocent in the plastic cradle. The man returned to the payphone, lifted the receiver, and set it back down without dialing. He folded the newspaper to its narrow strip again and walked toward the elevators. Eddie waited until the doors closed and the lobby was empty except for him and the hum. He walked to the machine slowly, as if slowness made him invisible. He reached into the coin return cup and pinched the paper rectangle between thumb and forefinger. It wasn't just paper. It was scored with a clean crease. It smelled faintly of smoke, like it had lived in a pocket next to a matchbook. Eddie didn't read it there. He didn't hold it up to the light. He slipped it into his pocket notebook and shut the cover. Back at the counter, he wrote one line. July 31, 6:30 a.m. late second man. He did not add a question mark. He sat down, took one sip of coffee, and said nothing to anyone who walked in afterward. On Monday, the 7th of August, 1978, Eddie got to the building early again, 6:05 a.m., but he didn't go straight to the vending alcove. He went upstairs. The manager's office smelled like old carpet and warm dust, the kind of room where paper lived longer than people's patience. A filing cabinet sat half open like it had given up on privacy years ago. On top of it, binders, stacks, a stapler with one good corner. Eddie had rehearsed the reason in his head on the stairs. Update the vendor file, insurance, emergency contact. Words that sounded boring enough to be true. The manager wasn't in yet. That was the point. Eddie didn't want a conversation. He wanted the quiet permission that came with being the first person to act like he belonged there. He found the contract binder where the spine label said it would be vendors, like the building was proud of how ordinary it was. Inside, everything was clean and dead. Carbon copies, renewal forms, little boxes checked in blue ink. Eddie flipped past laundry service, trash pickup, coffee supplier, then vending. A logo, a company name, a phone number. Eddie paused, then pulled the little printed sticker from his pocket, the one taped to the inside of the vending alcove cabinet door for service calls. He'd peeled it off last week under the excuse of cleaning. He compared the numbers. The binder listed one phone number. The sticker listed another. Not a single digit matched. He felt a cold, flat certainty spread through him, not panic, not triumph. Just the sense of stepping onto a floor that didn't creak because it wasn't real wood. He checked the invoices behind the contract page. The billing name was close, but not the same one word shifted. One abbreviation that didn't belong. Like someone copying a signature they'd only seen once. Eddie kept flipping. There should have been a roster. A list of authorized service staff. Names that made the gray shirt official. There wasn't. Just route technician, stamped in a blank box, as if the building had agreed not to ask for details. He closed the binder halfway and listened to the office. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked. He realized his hands were leaving fingerprints on paper, meant to feel untouched. He wiped his fingertips on his pants and kept going. In the back pocket of the binder was a thin sleeve with emergency contacts typed at the top. Eddie slid it out and found the same mismatch again. A different address than the one on the invoices. A different extension number than the sticker. A different reality depending on which page you believed. This wasn't a simple clerical error. Clerical errors had a messiness to them. They didn't line up this neatly. Footsteps approached in the hallway. Eddie slid the binder back into place and shut the cabinet with care that felt like guilt. The maintenance man, Frank, came in carrying a mug and a ring of keys as heavy as a weapon. He was the kind of guy who had always been here, which meant he was trusted without being liked. Frank looked at Eddie, then at the cabinet. "You locking up the building now, too?" Eddie kept his voice level. "Need the vending contact. People complain." Frank grunted like he understood scenes. He set his mug down and opened the cabinet again, faster than Eddie had. "Vending's a headache." Eddie pointed, casual, to the contract page. "This number doesn't match the service sticker downstairs." Frank leaned in. His brow didn't lift, but his eyes sharpened. He checked the invoice. Then the contract header. He wasn't reading like a clerk. He was reading like a man who's been blamed before and learned to smell blame coming. "That's weird," Frank said, which in his mouth meant, "This could get dumped on us." Eddie nodded once. Not excited. Not accusing. "I'm not calling anybody. I just want it clean." Frank stared at the paperwork for another beat, then shut the cabinet and took his mug back like the office might have ears. "You see the vendor today?" "Not yet." Frank's jaw worked once. "Don't ask him questions. Management hates drama." Eddie felt the old humiliation flare his supervisor's voice in the lobby, the laughter that wasn't cruel enough to call cruel. He swallowed it down. "I'm not asking," Eddie said. "I'm watching." As Frank looked at him longer than necessary. Then he nodded toward Eddie's pocket. "You writing times again?" Eddie didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Keep it quiet. If this is something, we handle it like building stuff. Not like whatever you're thinking." Eddie let that sit. Building stuff. Quiet. Routine preserved. That was fine. That was exactly how the gray shirt worked in the first place. By the time Eddie got back downstairs, the lobby was filling with morning motion. People with briefcases, people with keys, people whose presence was official because nobody challenged it. Eddie opened his notebook under the counter and added a new line, neat and small. AUG 7. Contract number. Mismatch. No roster. Then he circled the next fixed minute, the one the building had been taught to expect. Monday, AUG 21, 6:12 a.m. If the uniform depended on silence, Eddie would give it silence right up until the moment the silence gave him something solid to keep. On Monday, the 21st of August, 1978, Eddie arrived before the building decided what kind of day it was going to be. The lobby was already half awake. A cleaning crew moved through with carts that squeaked and rattled mops, buckets, rolled trash bags like dull ammunition. Someone from deliveries wheeled a hand truck past the elevators, the wheels thumping every seam in the tile. The doors opened, closed, opened again, swallowing people without ever making eye contact. It was public enough to make Eddie careful. It was noisy enough to hide a signal. At 6:11, Eddie stood behind the counter with his notebook tucked beneath the invoice stack, his pen uncapped like a nervous habit. He didn't stare at the vending alcove. He watched reflections in the machine glass, people passing, carts turning, the elevator lights blinking. At 6:12, the vending vendor came through the service corridor like he'd always had the right to be there. Gray shirt, key ring, no hurry. He rolled the dolly into position and opened the machine with the same practiced angle of his body, as if even the morning traffic might be reading his hands. Eddie's eyes went where he'd trained them to go. Not the vendor's face, not the crowd, straight to the seam of the inner panel. The vendor reached in. His hand disappeared behind the internal metal wall, deeper than it needed to for restocking. A cleaner pushed a cart past the alcove and didn't slow down. The delivery guy glanced once, bored, and looked away. The elevator chimed like a polite lie. Eddie saw the vendor's forearm tighten, then relax, like he'd unhooked something that wasn't supposed to move. For half a second, a corner of paper appeared thick, envelope-sized. Then it was gone into the vendor's other hand. The vendor's wrist turned, and something thin replaced it. A strip, maybe. A flat packet. Not money, not product. Something that didn't belong in a machine, meant to sell candy. He shut the panel fast. Too fast. The lock clicked once, then again harder than usual. The vendor's keys shook on the ring like they'd been yanked, and then Eddie's supervisor chose the moment to be present. He came out from the back office holding a clipboard and the kind of impatience that wanted to be witnessed. He looked past the vendor and focused on Eddie like Eddie was the only controllable thing in the lobby. "What are you doing out here this early?" He snapped, loud enough for the cleaners to hear, loud enough for the delivery guy to smirk. "Don't start your nonsense again. Let the man work." Eddie felt his face go blank on instinct. The old humiliation returned clean and automatic like it had been trained into him. "I'm just—" Eddie started. His supervisor cut him off with a sharp tilt of the head toward the back. "Inside." Now, the vendor didn't look up. He didn't look at Eddie. He didn't look at the supervisor. He only moved faster. He closed the machine door, turned the key, and almost as an afterthought pulled the coin return lever. Dry rattle, snap back. The ritual stayed, even under pressure. That part mattered. Then the vendor did something Eddie hadn't seen before. He aborted the restock. No glass wipe, no coin tray check, no lingering to make it look like a job. He grabbed the dolly and left early through the inner corridor, like the building was suddenly unsafe to occupy. Eddie's supervisor exhaled as if he'd prevented a disaster. "You hear me?" he said, quieter now, as if quieter was kinder. Eddie nodded once and walked back behind the counter. But the moment the supervisor turned away, already moving on to the next annoyance, Eddie's eyes returned to the machine. Not the snacks, not the price labels, the coin return. Something thin sat inside the cup like a piece of trash. The kind of thing nobody would pick up, and everybody would see. Eddie waited until a cleaner's cart rolled between them, blocking the alcove for 2 seconds. Then he moved. He stepped into the alcove like he was checking the machine, slipped his fingers into the coin return, and pulled out a narrow carbon copy receipt strip, folded once, crisp. It wasn't marked like money. It wasn't stained like trash. It had been placed like a bookmark. He didn't unfold it there. He didn't read it. He walked back to the counter and slid it into a plain envelope from the supply drawer, the kind used for petty cash slips and forgotten keys. He sealed it with one clean press and wrote, in small block letters, AUG 21. Then, in his pocket notebook, he wrote the rest fast but careful, like he was documenting weather. 6:12 a.m. Inner panel, exchange. Envelope-sized bundle removed. Thin item replaced. Vendor left early. Strip retrieved, sealed. Outside, the elevators kept opening and closing. People kept acting like uniforms meant safety. Like service routes were just service routes. Eddie set the sealed envelope beneath the register drawer and didn't touch it again. If the building wanted to erase what happened, it could. It could replace machines, change locks, rewrite schedules, but it would have to get past Eddie's handwriting first. On Monday, the 11th of September, 1978, Eddie got to the lobby early out of habit, not hope. The street outside looked scrubbed by night rain. The air had that first hint of fall, cool enough to wake you up. Not cool enough to be honest about winter. Eddie lifted the gate and felt the building settle around him like a coat you didn't remember putting on. The vending alcove was different, not in a dramatic way, in a way that felt practiced. The old machine, the one with the soft dent on the lower panel and the stubborn coin return, was gone. In its place stood a newer unit with fresh decals, brighter price labels, and a front face that hadn't learned the fingerprints of the building yet. The lock cylinder looked clean, like it hadn't been tested by impatient hands. The glass reflected the lobby too clearly, like it was proud of being unmarked. Eddie stopped a few feet short, coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't been told. He hadn't been asked. But the building didn't ask permission when it wanted to forget something. It just replaced the object that held the memory and called it maintenance. On the counter, taped beneath the phone, a single sheet of paper waited like an answer nobody wanted. Work order completed. Black type on thin stock. A form filled out with straight lines and short words. The kind of writing that tried to be harmless by being neat. Remove unit lobby, alcove. Replace unit updated lock. Service sticker. New contact. Completed by initials. Noah, opt, Shaptazech, she opt. Eddie stared at the initials. 2 letters. Not a name. Not a person. Just enough to satisfy a file. He peeled the corner of the paper up and saw the adhesive ring left behind. The work order had been placed there with intention, like a bandage meant to discourage picking at a wound. He took it down anyway and folded it once, then again, and slid it into his pocket notebook. The fluorescent lights hummed. The lobby air tasted like paper and coffee, the same as always. The elevators chimed above him, calm and indifferent. The building could change the machine, but it couldn't change the minute. Eddie watched the clock, Luden Schurfen. A cleaner passed through, pushing a cart that squeaked like a familiar lie. Eddie nodded. The cleaner nodded back. Neither of them spoke. In a building like this, speech was for people who wanted to be remembered. Luden Schurfen. Eddie stepped behind the counter and pulled open the register drawer, not to count money, but to touch the underside where he'd taped the plain envelope marked AUG 21 6:12 a.m. coin return. It was still there. The paper felt dry. The seal hadn't lifted. The building had replaced the machine, but it hadn't reached into Eddie's drawer. That was the only victory he trusted. Luden Schurfen. No footsteps. No dolly squeak. No gray shirt drifting in from the service corridor like a ghost with paperwork. The minute arrived cleanly and left cleanly, like it had never mattered. Eddie felt something loosen in him that he didn't want to name. Relief could be dangerous. It made you careless. It made you tell yourself the story was over because the noise stopped. He kept watching anyway. At 6:18, the lobby began to fill with the first official people of the day ties. Briefcases, keys, the small confidence of those who belonged. Someone bought a coffee from the kiosk and laughed too loudly. A delivery guy wheeled boxes past the alcove without ever turning his head. Eddie walked to the new vending machine and studied the service sticker. A new company name, a new phone number, a new reality printed in cheap ink. He didn't call it. Calling would turn his private knowledge into a public inconvenience, and Eddie had learned what happened when he became inconvenient. The building didn't confront you. It repositioned you. It made you smaller in front of witnesses until your questions sounded like personality flaws. His supervisor came out of the back office right on schedule, like nothing in the world had shifted. He glanced at Eddie near the vending alcove and frowned. "You still on that?" Eddie looked at him the way he looked at invoices. Flat, calm, unreadable. "Machine got replaced." "Good," his supervisor said, already turning away. "Handled." That word that meant, "Do not look closer." Eddie went back behind the counter and opened his pocket notebook to the last page. He wrote one final entry with the same careful block letters he'd taught himself to use when he was scared of being misunderstood. SEP 11 machine replaced new lock, new sticker. 6:12 a.m. Past no vendor. He stared at the ink until it dried. The building had narrowed the access window by removing the object that made the window useful. Whatever had been exchanged behind the inner panel, whatever timing had made possible, had been cut off cleanly, like a route canceled without explanation. And the person who had moved through the building on borrowed authority had vanished the way he'd always existed, without leaving a name. Eddie closed the notebook. He didn't throw it away. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He slid it into the drawer beneath the register, beside the sealed envelope, and pushed the drawer shut until it clicked. At the vending alcove, the new machine hummed with the bright innocence of fresh metal. People fed it coins and received snacks, and never once wondered who else it might be serving. Eddie returned to his invoices. The lobby became ordinary again. But every Monday after that, when the clock reached 6:12, Eddie always paused just long enough to listen for footsteps that didn't come. And then, quietly, he kept going.